needs little introduction. Although after 20 years of marriage, I readily admit that not a week goes by when I don't learn something new about him. He earned his accounting major and environmental studies minor from Northern Illinois University and his CPA certification prior to starting his career at Price Waterhouse in Milwaukee. Rich Mullicanen has few hobbies, but is a lifelong student and practitioner of many disciplines: operational efficiency and finance, organizational culture and trust building, leadership training and education, educational reform. He deeply loves his 2 daughters and our 4 grandchildren, and for them, he aims to be a worthy steward of the land where we live. Rich was inspired to speak to our congregation after attending the Leadership Corps training offered by Al Gore's Climate Reality Project. Today's presentation is a condensed version of the one that the Vice President gave on the first day of the workshop. Here is Rich Mullicanen.
I'll get this act together here in a second. There we go. Well, after that wonderful children's story that Mary found, I actually don't have to make this presentation, so. But I'll try anyway, see what you think. I don't know if anybody's had a chance to see former Vice President Al Gore do his PowerPoints. They're quite spectacular. He must have a huge staff of people who he takes advantage of to do these presentations. So if you can turn the lights off, honey, that would be great. Yeah, so all of this information on this presentation has been vetted, and my hat's off to him and his staff. So I'm going to talk I'm going to do the presentation, about 20-minute presentation, and then if we have a little time, which it looks like we will, I'll entertain some questions if anybody has any. All right, so we start at the beginning. I was going to do a show of hands who believes climate change is happening and who's not, but then I thought I don't want to put anybody on the spot. If there are any climate deniers in the audience, hopefully you'll ask some questions at the end and we'll have a chance to talk. Here are the average temperatures, pre-industrial and post-industrial, that have taken place over the last 100 or 150 years. It's a little concerning that the 10 hottest years ever in recorded history have been the last 10 years. Did anybody get to ski this winter? Well, one of the reasons why is because the average temperature during our winter was 8 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. 8 degrees. And much of the rest of the country had the same warmer weather. Not as bad as Phoenix, though. Phoenix had 54 days over at or above 110 degrees last summer. And that's not as bad as what Europe had. They had a 2-week heat wave, killed 8,300 people. Did anybody hear that story? I missed that one. Climate change doesn't only create warmer temperatures, but also increases the intensity of the storms. So for example, in the Northeast, the number of storms that dump more than 5 inches of precipitation in one day has doubled in number since the 1950s. We remember the big rains in Albany and surrounding area that caused $5 billion of damage in July last summer. In March of 2024, more than 30 million people were under flood warnings along the eastern seaboard. Here's a picture from New Hampshire. because of the fact that climate change is obviously affecting the storm patterns, some areas get more water than normal, others get less. For example, in 2022, California's agricultural industry lost $1.7 billion of food production because of the drought there. Droughts cause wildfires, or at least contribute to the creation of wildfires. As you probably know, Canada had a really bad year for wildfires last year. The amount of forest they lost was the equivalent area of the state of Connecticut, the state of Massachusetts, and the state of New York combined, is how much forest burned. And it did affect us. This warmer weather also affects the glaciers, and the glaciers, this one is a picture of a glacier breaking away and running downhill here toward the scientists. He survived. Those crazy scientists. So the climate change is not only melting the glaciers, it's melting the polar ice caps. Here's the 1,500-year trend in ice coverage in the Arctic Sea. See that little dip in the end there. 30 million tons an hour of ice is melting in Greenland. This is the one that the scientists think might break away and fall into the ocean. So climate change also, according to studies, has caused our prevailing winds that control much of our weather systems to dip more decidedly to the south during the winter. And you may remember this. This was an event in good old Buffalo, New York, where we had to cancel our playoff game because of the snowstorm and the bitter cold that occurred on January 15th this year. So what's causing this problem? Why are the temperatures rising and the storms getting bigger and all the rest of it? Is that caused by us, or is it just a normal period of time that the Earth is going through? We went over this already during the children's story. So the sun shines, the atmosphere traps some of them, reflects some back into the atmosphere, but some of the heat gets trapped, which is good because we like heat in the on the Earth, nice moderate temperatures. But the problem is when greenhouse gases get concentrated and more of those greenhouse gases get trapped in our atmosphere. So here you'll see the rate at which we're burning fossil fuel. So we kind of fell in love with fossil fuel back around post-war period, 1950, and it's been a really fast growth. You'll see that little chink in the upper, that's the pandemic. So even when we shut everything down, it's not really that much. We still are releasing a lot of greenhouse gases. But it's not just the burning of fossil fuels. We've managed to release greenhouse gases in a number of different ways. All told, humankind sends 162 million tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere every day. Every day. Now, if you were in my children's program, what they would say is, what about the trees? They're taking in the carbon dioxide. Well, the trees and the other natural sources in the, on the earth take in about 30 million tons a day of carbon dioxide. So you can see that $30 million is being absorbed by the Earth's natural processes, but that still leaves a big gap. So when people talk about net zero, getting to net zero, that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about getting to zero carbon release. They're talking about getting to the net zero, which is the amount that the Earth can naturally absorb for carbon dioxide. So I'd love to be up here telling you that things are as bad as they're going to get, and we've kind of plateaued, but unfortunately the scientists' consensus is otherwise. Here's the trend on the other pole. We talked about the Arctic sea loss down on the South Pole. Now the North Pole, I'm sorry, we were talking about the North Pole before. Now we're talking about the South Pole where Antarctica is. And you can see the trend line is not very good for us. All this melting ice, the 12 tons a day or 12 tons an hour, was it in Greenland? Can't keep track of these big numbers. Unfortunately, humankind has built a lot of their major cities right on the ocean. And as ocean levels rise, more and more assets are at risk. This chart shows that Miami may incur losses of $3 trillion with sea rise changes that are projected to 2070. Just to put that in perspective, the entire world had losses of about $3.3 trillion from natural disasters in 2023, in 1 year. You can imagine all the cities that could be affected by sea rise. Now that 3.3 trillion was up from 2.7 trillion in 2022. So it went up from 2.7 to 3.3 in 1 year. A lot of people have those nice oceanfront properties. 12 million of them could lose their houses based on a 2-degree Celsius rise in warming. We're at about 1.2 right now. So next couple of decades, we might get, we're trying to avoid getting to 2, hopefully. At some point, it just gets too hot and humid for a human being to live. The body cannot cool itself when temperatures get above a certain level. And right now, in these dark areas, in the middle of Africa here, those dark areas are uninhabitable today. Scientists think if current trends continue, the amount of uninhabitable land will dramatically increase by 2070. And 2070, what is that, 40 years away? Our children will be our age. Our age, I say my age. My grandchildren will be alive during this period of time. So look at South America, look at Africa, look at India with its dense population. So if these trends hold true, we could have 1 billion climate migrants in the future. 1 billion having to change their homes and move to a different part. Last year, 2023, we had 31 million climate migrants. Now, most of these were temporary, you know, a flood or something happened and they moved and they came back. And that was more migrants than were caused by all the wars in the country. That drought in California is going to become more commonplace. where we grow our crops. "50% of fish will be threatened by the warmer seas." I don't know if you heard the news reports, but south of Miami Beach, temperatures in the ocean were 100 degrees last summer. 100 degrees. Now that I've depressed all of you, the cool thing that's happening right now is that we're at the crux, and we could choose, even though we waited a really long time to get going, we're at now a crux where we could actually beat this thing, or we can lose the battle. Good old New York, compared to 2005, we're down 20%, our carbon emissions in the state. Has disaster rained down on the state of New York? No, we did it. And as the song says, if they can do it here, we can do it anywhere. We're one of 6 states that no longer have coal-fired power plants. We closed our last power plant in 2020. Another reason for hope is wind energy. I'm sure you've driven around the area and seen those big wind turbines. That's not only here, it's across the whole world. Had a very strong increase in wind energy usage. Solar energy has gone up faster. Look at that dramatic exponential increase in the number of solar installations. Why are these dramatic changes occurring, and why is there a reason for optimism? Well, it's economics. What's happened is that the cost of fossil fuels have been pretty steady over the last several decades, while the cost of wind power has gone down and the cost of solar energy has gone down dramatically. Now, you'll notice this chart ends in 2020. If you extend it, the cost of solar energy is now below the cost of fossil fuels. So in 80% of the world today, an installation of using solar energy will actually save money, even from the subsidized fossil fuel costs that are depicted in this chart. Those EVs that are floating around and those plug-in hybrids showing some exponential growth too. And more of these fossil fuel projects, I know at one point China was planning on building and opening 100 new or 200 new coal-fired power plants. And more of those projects are being canceled because of the economics. So here's the big one right here. By 2030, we now have the technology, according to the International Energy Agency, we now have the technology needed to reduce emissions by 50% during this decade. And Vice President Gore went on to say he's now seen enough evidence that he's convinced that we have the technology to get to net zero by 2050. That we now have the technology in hand, not anything new, not carbon capture, not any of these other technologies you've heard about, but technologies that are being used today are enough to get us to net zero by 2050. There's even reason to hope in the political realm. As you probably know, in 2015, the world leaders got together and made a historic agreement. I don't think world leaders have ever agreed on anything before, but they agreed to reduce carbon emissions so that we get to net zero by mid-century, 2050. Now, was that a political negotiation that got us to that number? No, it actually was a science-based number that they arrived at. The belief among scientists is that if we can get to net zero by 2050, that we will stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius global temperature rise. Why is that important? Well, when it gets above 1.5, the scientists describe all kinds of things, and I saved you from those apocalyptic projections. But there's all kinds of apocalyptic projections about what could happen if, for example, global temperatures get to 3 degrees Celsius above historical rates. So 1.5 will dodge the worst of the calamities and potentially apocalyptic calamities. So hitting that 2050 net zero is extremely important. The United States always in the forefront. That was sarcasm, by the way. In 2022, so only 7 years after the Paris Agreement was signed, we passed a huge federal bill to help make this a reality. So right now, if you went to electrify your home or use solar energy, you're eligible for rebates, both from the federal government and the state government. I mean, the federal and the state government, tax rebates, tax credits, and so forth that are available to implement renewables based on the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, I could have given you 12 or 15 slides on progress that's being made in other parts of the world, but I thought I would focus on the United States. So if there are 10 words that you can remember from this presentation, they are, it's happening, it's us, it's getting worse, and there is hope. Okay, 10 words. It's happening, it's us, it's getting worse, there is hope. But there's only hope if we act. So how can you act? Well, since the technology is there, it's really influencing people. It's influencing people, it's influencing governments, it's influencing businesses to take action. And those were pictures of some of the young people that Bob was talking about. Probably not appropriate for me to talk about the different candidates and their position on climate change, but it will make a big difference who is elected, both for federal office and Congress and state offices next year. So do your research on the candidates and see which ones are for implementation of climate change and which aren't. You have choices too. You have a carbon footprint. Now, I'm not going to make too big a deal about your individual carbon footprint because apparently now what was discovered is that campaign on figuring out your carbon footprint was created by the oil industry to try to change the focus on individual people trying to make change versus trying to make changes in industry-wide and government-wide. But you can make a difference. I mean, ultimately we need all of us to take action or we won't get to net zero. So as an example here, I've got a graph of where carbon gases are coming from. So individually, if you own a home, you could electrify. And I'm not talking about tearing everything out that's working, but as things wear out, as your dryer wears out, replace it with an electric one. As your furnace wears out, look at heat pumps, and solar energy potentially is help for that. When your car wears out and it's time to buy that new car, investigate plug-in hybrids and EVs. The next time you hear National Fuel is going to put a pipeline in, try to get them to stop because we don't need more fossil fuel, we need less fossil fuel. And by the way, I have to say this, natural gas is actually methane, and methane is 25 times worse as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. Natural gas, what a marketing ploy. Ooh, great. Waste, we all generate waste, so the old adage, reuse, recycle, reduce, still plays in. You have a pocketbook. You can influence companies to use good practices when it comes to implementation of better packaging and so forth. And then finally, agriculture. They said on the show, buy local. You could also reduce meat consumption. You don't have to become a vegan, but if you reduce meat consumption, it makes a big difference to your carbon footprint. So use your voice, use your vote, use your choices. Speak truth to power because it does make a difference. So we have, let's see, we have about 5 minutes to do a Q&A session here, so would anybody like to ask a question? Yes, Rebecca. Yeah, the question was, when we say we have the technology, does that mean we continue to live a high power consumption lifestyle, or does that also take into account the fact that we would become more austere, more careful, and so forth? What's happening in the world is that there's 400 or 500 million of us, like the United States and Europe and stuff, who live a high carbon footprint lifestyle. And as much that be good if everybody stopped, probably unrealistic. We do all kinds of campaigns for people to drive less, and then gas goes up 10 cents a gallon, and 3 million miles a day are driven less on the thruway. So people are driven by the economics of the fact that these renewable sources are coming down in price. That's what we talk about with technology. So theoretically, they said on the cartoon, on the story time, that you need to reduce your electricity. Actually, it was clear. We want to use more electricity because we want to take things that are now being, like my furnace is powered by natural gas. Well, if I can power my furnace by using a heat pump or by using solar power, I'd use more electricity, but I'd stop burning fossil fuels. And then I've got to go back and look at the source of my electricity. And the source of the electricity in Western New York, hydroelectric, which is a renewable source. Solar energy is increasingly becoming part of the use, and so forth. So then the other thing that's happening is that the other 7.5 billion people on this planet are striving to live the lifestyle that you and I and other people in Europe and stuff have been living for years, which entails more meat eating, more more cars, and so on and so forth. So we can't go and tell them, no, don't. You have to continue to live in a hut, and you have to continue to live without air conditioning, and you have to continue to live your old way. So the answer is what they're trying to do, what we're trying to do collectively, is to allow people to live a lifestyle, hopefully a little less wasteful than we live here in the United States, but do it in a way that it's carbon neutral. Oh. Keith.
On the increased electrification, guaranteed arguing with the grid. My first question is that true? And my second question is, what is working about nuclear these days?
Keith always gives me the tough questions. So he asked me a question about the power grid, because if you do all of a sudden get rid of all the gas-powered cars and have all these electric vehicles, you're going to tax the amount of electricity that's produced, and it's going to affect the power. So let me answer that question first. Clearly, Texas found out that their power grid was inadequate to withstand changes in climate change, where a whole bunch of the people in the state were out without electricity because of one winter storm. Millions of people were without electricity. So clearly, this country and the world is going to have to upgrade the power grids. So I don't happen to know exactly how inadequate it is, how much upgrade will be needed and how much that's going to cost, but Al Gore kept emphasizing that worldwide fossil fuel industry gets $2 trillion of subsidies, and they estimate that the cost to implement all these new technologies is about $1.5 trillion. And so we could actually pay for all of this stuff if we just took back the fossil fuel subsidies. So, and then your second question is where do we stand with nuclear power? Nuclear power the good news is nuclear power doesn't increase carbon emissions. The bad news is that it creates waste that lasts for an eternity. And so we still haven't figured out how to safely contain and dispose of, and basically it's containing. You can't dispose of it because it's always going to be dangerous. So you have to be able to figure out how to contain it. So they're still working on that. Certain countries like France are, much more dependent on nuclear energy, are using much more nuclear energy than the rest of the world, and we haven't heard about any catastrophes there, but don't think in the short term people are advocating for that, because the message that came across, because I've always been sitting there thinking these environmental groups should stop doing what they're doing and just focus entirely on carbon reduction. And a couple of the scientists who were at the conference said, look, remember that our natural world is what keeps our planet in sync and all the ecosystems in sync. And so if we continue down the road of cutting down forests and polluting the ocean and having this massive amount of plastic waste, and we hurt the planet's ability to take care of its share of this problem, it takes down, like I said, 30 or 40 million tons of CO2 is absorbed by the natural processes in the earth. Well, if we destroy the earth, the natural part of the earth, then that part won't happen anymore. So, Carlo. Yeah, his slide presentation was 500 slides. I did 60, so there's more to come if you want it.
Well, I want to say that after I heard about the conference you went to, I went on the site, and it got a tremendous bibliography there. And I share that, a million great articles.
Yeah, the Climate Reality Project, it's called. It was founded in 2006 by former Vice President Al Gore, and they put on these trainings like Mary and I had the good fortune to attend in the city a couple of weeks ago. They've trained 55,000 people. This was the 55th training session, and they do them all over the world. So if you like Italy, they're doing one in Rome this summer. And if you like the Motor City, they're doing one in Detroit in the fall, which you could probably drive to. Carpool. You can carpool too. Diana.
The pie chart you had at the end about what sectors of the economy contribute the most seems very valuable to me. I don't know if there's a way to have a copy of that. You might come to a decision that you want to make. What am I doing that will really make a difference? This is, trying to get more on my recycling plastic.
Yeah, it's important to keep perspective, right? I mean, what you can do right now is that the New York State NERSA, I can't ever remember. It's the New York State. NYSERDA? Yeah. So it's this regulatory agency around, power creation in the state, and you can call them, and they'll come out and do an energy audit of your home, because for most of us, energy, I mean, the home we own is the biggest carbon footprint, right? And second is your car, right? Or the plane rides you take or whatever. So those two are where your biggest bang for your buck individually is going to be. So that's a great point. But I can print this out and have some copies next week. Okay, last question, Bob. Oh, thank you. It would be great to get the church to net zero.
Yes.
I think that those kind of projects would be really cool. But I'm going to stop now so we can do our annual meeting.